There are kings who inherit thrones, and there are kings who inherit death sentences. Baldwin IV inherited both on the same day, and on this November afternoon, he is about to prove that the second one made the first one worth something. It is just past noon on November 25th, 1177. A 16-year-old boy is strapped to a horse. His hands are wrapped in linen because the skin is coming apart. His fingers cannot grip the reins. His legs have been tied to the stirrups by his own servants because his body is too weak to hold the saddle on its own. He is Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, and in less than an hour, he is about to destroy the most powerful army in the Middle East. Ahead of him, spread across muddy fields and choking the ford of a shallow stream, stands an army of somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men, cavalry, archers, infantry, and camp followers stretching back as far as the eye can see. Behind Baldwin, there are fewer than 500 knights. In the time it takes to eat a meal, nearly everyone on one side will be dead or running for their lives. The question is, which side? The army Baldwin is about to charge belongs to Saladin, the same Saladin who 10 years later will capture Jerusalem and become the most celebrated Muslim commander of the medieval world. But today, Saladin is going to be routed, broken, chased from the field by a dying teenager with a fraction of his numbers. And this story, one of the most lopsided and devastating victories of the entire crusading era, has been almost completely forgotten. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what happened on that November afternoon and why history chose to bury it. Baldwin IV did not choose to be a warrior. He was a boy who liked theology and books, raised in the royal court of Jerusalem by his tutor, a scholar named William of Tyre. William was the one who first noticed something was wrong. Years earlier, when Baldwin was still a child, William watched the boys of the court playing a rough game, pinching and slapping each other's arms and hands. The other boys yelped and pulled away. Baldwin did not. William later wrote that when the boys struck and buffeted each other, the others showed pain in their hands, but Baldwin endured it without any sign of discomfort. The boy could not feel his own skin. It was leprosy, the disease that would eat him alive over the next decade, dissolving his face, crippling his hands, and blinding his eyes one nerve at a time. There is something in that image of a child playing with other children, laughing, roughhousing, and not feeling what they feel, that contains the entire tragedy of Baldwin's life. The disease was already inside him. It had already begun its work, and the boy did not know it yet, because the first thing leprosy takes is the ability to feel. By 1177, Baldwin was 16. He had been king for 3 years. His body was already failing him. And yet when news reached Jerusalem that Saladin had crossed the Sinai with an army of thousands, Baldwin did not hesitate. He rode south. The man marching north to meet him was everything Baldwin was not. Saladin was 39 years old, a Kurdish-born general who had clawed his way from military administrator to Sultan of Egypt and master of much of Syria. He was pious, calculating, and supremely confident. He had marched his army 450 kilometers across the Sinai Desert through scorching days and freezing nights along roads that were little more than tracks between wells, because he believed the kingdom of Jerusalem was on the verge of collapse. By almost every measure, he was right. The soldiers Saladin brought were not a faceless horde. There were Kurdish cavalrymen who had spent their lives in the saddle, Turkoman horse archers from the steppe, fast and lethal at range, Sudanese infantrymen, veterans of a dozen campaigns, Arab tribal fighters from Syria, and behind them, trailing for miles, came the people who kept an army alive: smiths, butchers, servants, merchants, and the families of soldiers who followed the column because they had nowhere else to go. Many of these men had fought Franks before. None of them expected what was about to happen. When Baldwin rode out of Jerusalem toward Ascalon, he brought a handful of household knights and whatever men he could scrape together on short notice. At Ascalon, he gathered more: local garrison troops, Hospitaller knights, baronial contingents from the surrounding countryside. The numbers, when he counted them, were grim. Fewer than 500 mailed knights in total, among them 80 Templars from Gaza and the surrounding commanderies, plus their sergeants and mounted Turcopoles. Behind the cavalry stood perhaps 3,000 infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, and swordsmen. It was not an army, it was a raiding party with a king attached. Across the coastal plain, Saladin's main force numbered somewhere between 10 and 15,000. The old Christian chronicles inflate this to 26,000, but even conservative modern estimates put the Franks outnumbered at least 3-1. Riding beside Baldwin was a man the Muslim world hated more than any other Frank alive. Reynold of Chatillon was in his late 40s, a French knight who had come east during the Second Crusade and never left. He had married into the Principality of Antioch. He had attacked the Christian island of Cyprus and tortured the Patriarch of Antioch by smearing honey on his head and staking him out in the sun for insects to devour. He had then spent 15 years rotting in a Muslim prison after being captured. He had been released only recently. He was brutal, opportunistic, and completely fearless. Muslim historians would later call him the worst of the Franks. But on this day, Baldwin needed the worst of the Franks. Commanding the 80 Templars was Odo de Saint-Amand, a hard, quiet man from Limousin in France. The Templar rule was explicit. A Templar should prefer death to flight. Odo had built his entire life around that sentence. 2 years after Montgisard, he would be captured by Saladin and die in a Muslim prison rather than let his order break its own rule by paying his ransom. There is a difference between men who are willing to die and men who have already decided to. The first kind hesitates, the second kind does not. Odo's 80 Templars were the second kind. When Baldwin gave the order to charge, these 80 men were not weighing their odds. They had already made their calculation. Death was acceptable, retreat was not. The ground where this would be decided lay near a low ridge and a shallow stream that modern historians identify with a seasonal watercourse between Ramla and the sea. November rains had soaked the plowed fields north of the stream into a muddy, half-marshy expanse. A narrow ford crossed the water. It was a bottleneck, a place where an army in retreat would compress, slow, and die. Saladin's error was not arrogance. It was reasonable expectation. His scouts had told him the Franks were divided, their best troops committed elsewhere. He had marched through this territory before without serious opposition, so he did what any rational commander would do. He dispersed his forces into raiding columns to maximize damage and loot. Sound strategy, until it wasn't. His army was spread across the coastal plain in loose raiding parties. It was about to face a concentrated Frankish charge at the worst possible moment, while half his men were on the wrong side of a muddy ford. This is the moment that decides everything. Baldwin, in or near Ascalon, has gathered his small force. He knows the numbers. He knows what his body is doing to him. And he has a choice. He can stay behind the walls. Ascalon is strong. Jerusalem is strong. Saladin might raid the countryside, burn villages, take prisoners. But walls do not break easily in the 12th century. Baldwin can wait. He can let Saladin exhaust himself. He can preserve his army and hope for reinforcements from the north. Or he can ride out. The men around him, Reynold, Odo, the barons, know what riding out means. It means meeting Saladin in the open field with fewer than 500 knights against an army 3 times their size. If the charge fails, there will be no reserve. There will be no second chance. The kingdom's only field army will be destroyed, and the road to Jerusalem will be open. Baldwin chooses to ride. We do not have his exact words. No chronicler recorded the speech he gave or the argument he made. What we know is the result. The entire force, every knight, every sergeant, every footman, marches out of Ascalon and turns northeast, pushing hard along interior roads toward the place where Saladin's army is strung out across the plain. It is a 50-kilometer forced march through the night with a sick king at the head of the column. Every rational calculation said hide. Baldwin was 16 years old and dying. He was not rational. He was something more dangerous than rational. He was certain. The choice he made that day was the choice of a man who understood he was already dying and had nothing left to lose but everything left to protect. By the morning of November 25th, the two forces are within striking distance, and Saladin still does not know Baldwin is coming. Muslim scouts spot something they did not expect. A column of Frankish cavalry flying the royal banner of Jerusalem, advancing from the east. The news reaches Saladin. The Sultan registers it with what must have been disbelief. Baldwin is here, not behind walls, not cowering in Ascalon. He is here in the open with an army. Here is the detail about Saladin's intelligence failure that changes everything. He had scouts. He had informants. He had been operating in this region for weeks. And yet a force of nearly 4,000 men, led by the king himself, marched 50 kilometers across the countryside and appeared on his flank without warning. That is not just a failure of scouting. That is the sound of a commander so confident in his enemy's weakness that he stopped looking. The Franks halt near the ridge overlooking the stream and the muddy fields where Saladin's army is partially deployed. Baldwin gives the order to form battle lines. And then comes the moment that every chronicler records. The king has to be lifted onto his horse. His servants wrap his hands. They strap his legs to the stirrups. They bind him into the saddle so that if he loses consciousness, he will not fall. He is 16 years old. His skin is coming apart. His body is betraying him in ways that would confine most men to a sickbed. And he is about to lead a cavalry charge against the largest army in the Middle East. The clergy bring forward the relic of the true cross, the most sacred object in the kingdom, a fragment of the wood on which Christ was believed to have died. It is raised before the army. The king, despite being leprous and very weak, ordered that he be mounted on his horse and tied to the saddle. And thus he rode before all, holding the banner of the Holy Cross. And all took great courage from seeing him. Picture it, a boy who looks like death itself, framed in armor and sacred wood, riding at the head of an army that knows it is outnumbered. To the common soldiers behind him, this must have looked less like war and more like scripture coming to life. His hands could not grip the reins, his legs could not hold the saddle, his eyes were beginning to fail, and every man on that field would follow him into hell. Because courage is not the absence of weakness. It is the refusal to let weakness decide. To understand what is about to happen, you need to understand the physics of a 12th century cavalry charge. A Frankish warhorse weighs somewhere around 600 kilograms. The knight on its back in full mail, with helmet, shield, and lance, adds another 100. When that combined mass hits a gallop, 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, and drives a 3-meter lance into a man's chest, the energy transferred is roughly equivalent to being hit by a small car. Now multiply that by 400, at once, in a line. Baldwin forms his knights into dense lines. The Templars take their position. 80 armored horsemen in tight formation, their black and white banners snapping in the November wind. Behind them, sergeants on lighter horses. On the flanks, Turcopole-mounted archers. Further back, the infantry who will follow the cavalry into whatever gap the charge creates. The distance between the Frankish line and Saladin's disorganized mass is a few hundred meters, close enough to see individual faces, close enough to hear the shouting. This is the last moment of choice. Baldwin can see what is in front of him. He can see the numbers. He can see the chaos at the ford. And he can see the muddy ground and the ridge behind him that offers escape if the charge breaks. Every man on the line knows that in the next few minutes, they will either break Saladin's army or be swallowed by it. There is no middle outcome. Baldwin gives the order. The Frankish line steps forward. Walk. The horses move as one, a wall of iron and muscle. The ground trembles. Trot. The speed increases. The riders lower their lances. The distance closes. 300 meters, 200, 100. The Muslim soldiers at the front of Saladin's formation can now feel the ground vibrating beneath their feet. They can see the wall of horsemen accelerating toward them. Some begin to shout, some begin to run, and then the Franks hit the gallop. The Frankish charge hits Saladin's front like a battering ram striking a door that was already cracked. The first line of Muslim cavalry absorbs the impact for perhaps 10 seconds before it disintegrates. Lances shatter on impact. Knights drop the splintered shafts and draw swords. The second rank of Frankish horsemen drives through the gaps opened by the first. The sound is something no one on that field has ever heard before. Hundreds of collisions of metal, bone, horseflesh, and screaming men compressed into a few seconds of total violence. The center of Saladin's line caves inward. Men who moments ago were standing in formation are now on the ground, trampled, crushed under falling horses. The Frankish wedge, a concentrated mass of armored cavalry, punches through the middle and keeps going. It does not stop. It does not pause to regroup. It drives forward into the depth of Saladin's army, splitting it in two. Several of Saladin's own kinsmen and bodyguards are cut down in the first minutes, fighting to hold a line that no longer exists. The 80 Templars fight as a single unit, driving into the thickest concentration of Muslim resistance. Their discipline is terrifying. Where other knights might pause, wheel, regroup, the Templars push forward. Their rule tells them to prefer death to flight. They demonstrate it now, cutting their way towards Saladin's personal standard. Baldwin, strapped into his saddle, is somewhere in the mass. The chronicles say he fought. How a 16-year-old with crippled hands and diminishing eyesight fought in a medieval cavalry melee is a question the sources do not adequately answer. What they do say is that he was present, that he did not fall back, and that the men around him fought like men who had seen something they could not explain. A boy who should be dead, leading them into the worst of the fighting. There is a moment in every battle when one side realizes it has lost. At Montgisard, that moment comes when the Frankish charge reaches the vicinity of Saladin's personal standard, and the Sultan's bodyguard begins to fall. Saladin can see it happening. His center is gone. His wings are not reinforcing, they are pulling back. Some units are already turning to flee toward the ford. The raiding parties he had scattered across the countryside are miles away, useless. The baggage train clogging the crossing is now a death trap for his own men. The army he marched 450 kilometers to deploy is disintegrating in front of his eyes. Saladin, seeing that his men were falling on every side and that the whole army was thrown into confusion, abandoned the field and fled. He left behind his tents, his baggage, and an immense amount of plunder, and escaped with difficulty with a small escort. Those words deserve attention. With difficulty. Saladin does not retreat in good order. He runs. A small knot of bodyguards fight their way clear of the collapsing army. They abandon everything. The Sultan's personal tent, his treasury, his war equipment, his supplies. Saladin, the man who had crossed a desert to destroy the kingdom of Jerusalem, flees with nothing but the men who can keep up with his horse. Behind him, his army does what every broken army does. It runs for the only exit it knows, the ford. And what happens next is the part of Montgisard that truly earned its reputation for brutality. Not the charge, not the melee. What happens at that ford? Because a retreating army and a narrow river crossing are two things that, when combined, produce not a battle, but a slaughter. The ford across the stream is narrow. It was designed for commerce, farmers crossing with carts, travelers with pack animals. It was not designed for 10,000 panicking soldiers trying to cross at once. What happened there was not warfare. It was gravity and geometry doing the work that swords had already started. The retreating army compresses toward the crossing point. Men on horseback crash into men on foot. Pack animals, maddened by the noise and the smell of blood, lunge sideways and block the approach. Wagons from the baggage train, the same wagons that were still crossing when Baldwin charged, are now immovable obstacles wedged into the ford at angles that block all passage. The killing is systematic. The Frankish knights, their horses lathered and blowing, ride up to the edge of the compressed mass and strike. There is no resistance. The men at the back of the crowd cannot see what is happening at the front. They push forward. The men at the front are being driven into the water or cut down where they stand. Men fall into the stream in mail or padded armor. They sink immediately. Others are pushed in by the weight of the crowd behind them. The water, shallow enough to wade in normal conditions, becomes a trap. Its banks are mud. Its bed is slick, and the bodies of men and horses quickly create a dam of flesh that backs up the water and deepens the crossing. Men drown in water that was knee-deep an hour ago. The ford becomes choked with corpses. Men trying to cross must climb over the dead. Horses refuse to enter the water. The sounds at the ford are not the sounds of battle anymore. They are the sounds of a stampede, screaming, splashing, the crack of breaking bone, the desperate gurgling of men drowning under the weight of other men. Some Muslim soldiers, seeing the ford as death, scatter into the fields. They run north into the November mud, where the rain-soaked, plowed earth grabs at their boots and drags them to a halt. Frankish cavalry ride them down at leisure. Others break south toward Gaza, or east toward the Judean hills. Most do not make it far. Baldwin's captains do not stop. The pursuit begins immediately and extends for 12 miles. Frankish knights and mounted sergeants chase fragments of Saladin's army across the coastal plain as the afternoon light begins to fade. Small groups of Muslim soldiers separated from their units are ridden down in fields, on roads, in the outskirts of villages. Every man who escapes is a soldier who can fight again. Every horse recovered is a horse the kingdom desperately needs, and every mile of pursuit deepens the catastrophe for Saladin, not just in men lost, but in prestige destroyed. A sultan whose army is chased for 12 miles by fewer than 500 knights is a sultan whose authority has been publicly shattered. And behind the pursuit, the ford lay silent, choked with the dead, the water running dark into the November soil. By dusk, the pursuit slows. The Frankish horses are spent. The men are exhausted. They have been marching or fighting since the previous night. The coastal plain is littered with the debris of a destroyed army. Abandoned weapons, empty tents, scattered supplies, wounded men crawling toward water. The Franks turn back toward the battlefield. They ride through what they have done. The fields between the ridge and the ford are carpeted with dead men and horses lying in the mud, some in heaps where they fell, trying to protect each other, others alone, where they were ridden down in flight. Baldwin, still strapped into his saddle, rides back through the carnage. He is 16 years old. He has just won one of the most decisive victories in the history of the Crusades, and his body is already killing him. The Franks camp on the field. There is no choice. The men are too tired to move, the horses too spent. They sleep among the dead. The sounds of the night are the sounds of aftermath, the groaning of wounded men, the snorting of horses too injured to stand, the quiet movement of soldiers stripping armor and weapons from the dead. William of Tyre, writing within a few years of the battle, gives the number that would define Montgisard. So great was the destruction that scarcely a tenth part of the enemy escaped. 90%. If we accept the modern estimate of 10 to 15,000 in Saladin's main force, that means 8 to 13,000 casualties, killed, captured, scattered, or drowned at the ford. The real number is almost certainly lower. Armies in the medieval period rarely suffer 90% losses and continue to exist as political entities. But even the conservative modern reading, several thousand dead, many more wounded and scattered, makes Montgisard one of the most devastating defeats Saladin ever suffered. The Muslim sources confirm the scale. Ibn al-Athir, writing about 40 years later, recorded that the Muslims met with a great disaster and only a small group returned with the Sultan. That is the Muslim historian's way of confirming what the Frankish sources say with numbers. Saladin's army did not retreat. It ceased to exist as a fighting force. Saladin had gambled everything, his army, his treasury, his personal prestige, on the invasion of the kingdom. He had lost all of it. To the boy who could not feel his own hands. Saladin reached Cairo on December 8, 1177, 2 weeks after the battle. He had avoided the main roads, traveling fast and light, accompanied by a fraction of the men who had marched out with him weeks earlier. The man who had crossed a desert to crush Jerusalem went home with nothing but the men who could keep up with his horse. For Baldwin, the victory at Montgisard was both triumph and tragedy in a single breath. His authority within the kingdom was now beyond question. The barons, the military orders, the factions that had whispered about a boy king with a rotting body were silenced. He had proven he could fight. He had proven he could lead. But the disease did not care about victories. By the early 1180s, Baldwin's leprosy had advanced to the point where he was losing his sight, losing the use of his limbs, and requiring regents to govern in his name. He had saved his kingdom on the fields of Montgisard. He could not save himself. Baldwin continued to fight. He defeated Saladin again at the Battle of Belvoir in 1182. He negotiated truces. He held the kingdom together through sheer force of will, even as his body dissolved around the will that drove it. He died in 1185. He was 24 years old. 2 years later, Saladin crushed the Frankish army at the Battle of Hattin and captured Jerusalem. Raynald of Châtillon, the man who had ridden beside Baldwin at Montgisard, the worst of the Franks, was personally executed by Saladin after the battle. The sword that had charged at Montgisard ended on a different battlefield, under a different sky, with a different outcome. Saladin's response to Montgisard was the response of a man who transforms humiliation into fuel. He did not collapse, he rebuilt. Over the next decade, he reorganized his army, tightened his alliances, and pursued the rhetoric of jihad with an intensity that suggested a man who was never going to be caught unprepared again. Montgisard did not destroy Saladin, it forged him. He returned to Egypt carrying the memory of that November afternoon like a scar that would not close. He spent the next decade making certain that nothing like Montgisard would ever happen again. He unified Egypt and Syria under a single command. He built an army that did not depend on scattered raiding parties, but moved as a single disciplined force. And he waited for the kingdom of Jerusalem to make the mistakes that Baldwin had been too brilliant to make while he was alive. The irony of history's memory is staggering. Saladin became the most celebrated Muslim commander of the medieval age, and deservedly so. His capture of Jerusalem, his treatment of prisoners, his generosity to defeated enemies, all earned him a reputation that endures to this day. But in the process, Montgisard was quietly pushed to the margins. A defeat this total, this humiliating, at the hands of a teenage leper, did not fit the narrative of Saladin's greatness. Muslim chroniclers acknowledged it, then moved past it. Western historians focused on the drama of Jerusalem's fall and followed suit. And Baldwin himself was mythologized in ways that distort as much as they honor. Modern depictions, most notably in Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, portray him as a sage philosopher king in a silver mask. The mask is a modern invention. There is no evidence Baldwin wore one. He was a boy, brilliant, stubborn, doomed, who fought in the open with his disease visible to everyone around him. The real Baldwin is more impressive than the myth. He did not need a mask to inspire men to follow him into an impossible charge. Today, there is no major monument at the site of Montgisard. No museum, no memorial. The exact hilltop where Baldwin formed his line is still debated by scholars. 13th century pilgrims reported that the bones of the dead were still visible in the fields. Today, even the bones are gone. Go back to that image from the beginning. A 16-year-old boy strapped to a horse because his body is failing. His hands wrapped in linen, his legs tied to the stirrups. Ahead of him, an army of 10,000 men led by the most powerful sultan in the Islamic world. Behind him, fewer than 500 knights. He cannot feel his own hands. He is going to charge, and he is going to win. Not because of divine intervention, though his contemporaries believed that, not because of luck, because a dying boy chose to fight when every rational calculation said he should hide. Baldwin IV was given a kingdom and a death sentence in the same breath. He held one with hands that were already losing their grip. Montgisard was not a battle won by strength. It was a battle won by a boy who understood that dying slowly was not a reason to stop fighting. It was a reason to start.